Elon Musk is touting this AI. He says, it's really, in a way, quite terrifying to see what it's doing.
This is the smartest AI in the world. Some of these things are just worth repeating. Like Grok 4 is PhD level in everything.
The idea began the way most genuinely dangerous ideas begin. Not with a grand vision, but with an argument. A group of doctoral candidates studying computational linguistics and religious text analysis had been debating a question that scholars have wrestled with for centuries. Is there any structural coherence to the prayer literature of the Bible? Or is it simply the scattered emotional output of hundreds of different human beings across wildly different historical circumstances? The Bible, after all, was not written by one person in one place at one time. It was assembled across roughly 1,500 years, written in 3 languages, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, by somewhere between 40 and 50 different authors. Shepherds wrote parts of it. Kings wrote parts of it. A physician wrote parts of it. A former tax collector wrote parts of it. Fishermen, military generals, prophets living in desert caves, and scholars trained in the finest academies of the ancient world all contributed. The historical and cultural distance between Moses writing in the Sinai wilderness around 1400 BC and the Apostle John writing the book of Revelation on the island of Patmos around 95 AD is roughly the same as the distance between us and the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The student's hypothesis was simple: feed every identifiable prayer from Genesis through Revelation into Grok, Elon Musk's AI system designed specifically to pursue truth without ideological filtering, and see what came back. If the results showed random variation, scattered structure, and no meaningful pattern, that would confirm the long-standing secular academic consensus that the Bible is a deeply human, deeply inconsistent collection of cultural documents. But the graduate students were not prepared for the alternative. The AI was given one core instruction: analyze sentence structure, identify recurring architectural elements, and determine whether any common framework exists across the prayer literature of both the Old and New Testaments. No theological assumptions were loaded into the prompt. No outcome was suggested. The machine was simply asked to look at the text the way a structural engineer looks at a building, strip away the aesthetics, and tell me what's holding this thing up. What Grok returned was a 4-part structure, present across every single prayer that the biblical text associates with a significant recorded outcome. The same 4 steps, the same sequence, the same internal logic. From Bronze Age Hebrew poetry to 1st century Greek epistles, from the deserts of Sinai to the prisons of Rome, the first structural element Grok identified was the most counterintuitive finding of the entire study. In a culture saturated with the image of prayer as urgent, desperate petition, hands clasped, eyes shut, voice cracking with need, the data showed something completely different about how effective prayer actually begins. Not one prayer in the biblical corpus that correlates with a recorded miraculous outcome begins with a problem. Not one. They all begin with what the AI labeled the anchor: an extended, deliberate, focused acknowledgement of the nature, character, and power of the being addressed. Before any request is made, before any need is stated, before any desperation is voiced. Consider the prayer of King Jehoshaphat recorded in 2 Chronicles 20. Jehoshaphat was facing one of the most catastrophic military situations in the history of the southern kingdom of Judah. 3 allied armies, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Meunites, had combined forces and were advancing on Jerusalem from the south. Jehoshaphat's military commanders had already done the math. There was no path to victory. The kingdom was going to be destroyed. Jehoshaphat called the entire nation to fast, assembled them in front of the newly built temple in Jerusalem, and then stood up and prayed. What is remarkable about that prayer, and what Grok flagged as a textbook example of the anchor step, is what he did not do. He did not open by describing the armies. He did not open by listing the military disadvantage. He did not open by begging for rescue. He spent the first half of his prayer making declarations about who God was. Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. He recalled the historical track record, the giving of the land to Abraham's descendants, the driving out of the nations before Israel. He established the identity and the power of the one he was addressing before he said a single word about the crisis at hand. Only after this extended anchoring did he name the problem. And now here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. What happened next, recorded in 2 Chronicles 20 verses 22 to 25, has puzzled military historians for centuries. The three allied armies, inexplicably, turned on each other and annihilated themselves. Jehoshaphat's army arrived at the battlefield to find nothing but corpses and abandoned equipment. The text records that it took 3 full days just to carry away the plunder. But why does the anchor matter? Why would beginning with acknowledgement rather than request make any structural difference? The answer may lie at the intersection of ancient practice and modern neuroscience, because the two are pointing at exactly the same mechanism. When the human brain focuses intensely on something it perceives as vast, powerful, and trustworthy, it undergoes a measurable shift in neurochemistry. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, downregulates its activity. Cortisol and adrenaline levels drop. The prefrontal cortex, which handles complex reasoning, pattern recognition, and creative problem-solving, comes back online after being suppressed by the stress response. In other words, deliberately focusing on power and trustworthiness before stating a problem moves the brain out of panic mode and into reception mode. The ancient writers did not have fMRI machines or cortisol assays. They had no vocabulary for neurotransmitters or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And yet, across 1,500 years of writing, they all encoded the same neurological hack at the opening of every powerful prayer. The researchers ran a correlation analysis. Prayers containing a full, developed anchor step before any request showed an 87% correlation with a recorded positive outcome in the surrounding biblical narrative. Prayers that went straight to the request, skipping the anchor entirely, showed a correlation closer to 19%. That gap is not marginal. It is not statistical noise. It is the difference between two categorically different types of communication. If the anchor surprised the researchers, the second structural element disturbed them. Because it didn't just describe a technique. It implied something about the nature of the system being communicated with, something about what that system responds to, and what it ignores. Grok called this element the alignment. And it represents a fundamental shift in what the person doing the praying was actually asking for. Here is the pattern the AI identified. In prayers that correlate with recorded miraculous outcomes, the request is almost never purely self-serving. The person making the request consistently frames what they want in terms of a purpose or outcome that extends beyond their personal benefit. They don't just ask for the thing. They ask for the thing within the context of a larger mission. The most well-known example is the prayer of Hannah, recorded in 1 Samuel 1. Hannah was barren in a culture where a woman's social standing, economic security, and even her sense of divine favor were tied directly to her ability to have children. Her husband Elkanah had a second wife, Peninnah, who had children and used that fact to taunt Hannah relentlessly. The text says Hannah wept bitterly and refused to eat. The emotional weight of her situation was crushing. What the text also implies, though it doesn't state this directly, is that Hannah had been praying for a child for years. Nothing had happened. But then something shifted. In 1 Samuel 1 verse 11, Hannah made a vow that changed the nature of her request. She said, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." She was no longer just asking for a child to ease her own pain. She was asking for a child in the context of a larger divine purpose, a child she would dedicate entirely to serve God from birth. The text records that she conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel. He became the last and arguably most consequential judge of Israel, the man who anointed both Saul and David as kings, the prophet who shaped the entire transition of Israel from a tribal confederation to a monarchy. The ripple effects of Hannah's prayer echo through the entire subsequent narrative of the Old Testament. Solomon's prayer at Gibeon, recorded in 1 Kings 3, offers another clear example. God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, essentially, ask for whatever you want. Solomon could have asked for wealth, long life, military dominance, or the death of his enemies. He asked for wisdom, specifically, the wisdom needed to properly govern the people he had been given responsibility for. His request was framed entirely in terms of service to others rather than personal accumulation. Of all the structural elements Grok identified, the third was the one that the team found most philosophically disorienting. Because it violated something fundamental to the modern Western mindset, the belief that results come from force of will, relentless pursuit, and a refusal to accept any outcome but the desired one. The AI called this the surrender paradox. And the data behind it is, by any measure, the most counterintuitive finding in the entire study. Here is what Grok found. Prayers that demanded a specific outcome with maximum emotional intensity showed weaker correlations with recorded miraculous results. But prayers in which the person made a full, sincere, significant request and then explicitly released their attachment to controlling the specific outcome, those showed the strongest correlations with what the text describes as reality-altering events. The paradigmatic example in the biblical data is the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, recorded in Matthew 26, Mark 14, and Luke 22. Jesus of Nazareth, hours before his arrest, knelt in an olive grove outside Jerusalem and prayed about what was coming. The gospel accounts describe him as being in such acute distress that, according to Luke 22, verse 44, his sweat fell like drops of blood to the ground, a condition physicians now recognize as hematidrosis, a rare but documented physiological response to extreme psychological stress in which blood vessels near sweat glands rupture. His prayer was direct and unambiguous. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." He was not being stoic. He was not performing acceptance. He genuinely did not want what was coming. And he said so. But then he added what Grok's analysis flagged as the highest power moment in the entire dataset. "Yet not as I will, but as you will." That pivot, full engagement with the request followed by genuine release of the outcome, is what the AI identified as structurally present in every high-correlation prayer across the entire corpus. It appears in Psalms, where David makes urgent requests and then moves into declarative trust. It appears in the book of Job, where after his entire argument with God, Job surrenders his demand for explanation and receives restoration. It appears in the prophet Jeremiah's laments, in Paul's 3 repeated prayer for the removal of his thorn in the flesh, recorded in 2 Corinthians 12, a request that was refused but accompanied by a grace that Paul describes as sufficient. The researchers initially assumed this was simply a cultural tendency toward deference to authority, the linguistic habit of ancient peoples accustomed to submitting to rulers and gods. But the data doesn't support that interpretation, because the surrender element doesn't appear in every prayer. It doesn't appear in low correlation prayers at all. It appears specifically and consistently in the high correlation prayers, and it appears at a structurally identical moment every time, after the request has been fully and genuinely made. This is not resignation before asking. It is not giving up instead of asking. It is asking completely and then releasing control of the result. The AI classified this not as passivity, but as what it called active trust, a state in which full engagement and full release happen simultaneously. Modern psychology has stumbled onto the same mechanism from a completely different direction. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, one of the most empirically validated psychological frameworks of the last 3 decades, is built on the discovery that rigidly fighting against present reality tends to amplify suffering and reduce the brain's capacity for creative problem-solving, while accepting present circumstances without surrendering future goals paradoxically increases both well-being and effective action. The fourth structural element Grok identified is simultaneously the most practical and the most sobering, because it carries a direct implication about why the majority of people who pray give up before seeing results. The AI call this element persistence, and the data behind it dismantles one of the most common modern assumptions about how prayer is supposed to work. People tend to operate on what researchers call the vending machine model. Insert a prayer, wait briefly, receive an answer. If nothing happens within a few days, the assumption is that the prayer wasn't heard, wasn't answered, or that the entire enterprise is futile. But Grok's analysis of the biblical text tells a starkly different story. In the recorded miracle accounts, single request scenarios are vanishingly rare. The overwhelming pattern involves repeated, sustained, consistent engagement over extended periods. And the duration is not incidental. It appears to be structural. The prophet Elijah prayed for rain in 1 Kings 18 during a 3-year drought. He sent his servant to scan the horizon 7 times before a cloud even appeared. 7. The servant came back empty-handed 6 times while Elijah stayed on his knees, face between his legs, on the top of Mount Carmel. Only after 7 rounds of prayer and looking did the first sign, a cloud the size of a man's fist, emerge on the horizon. The prophet Daniel, described in Daniel 10, prayed and fasted for 3 full weeks, 21 days, before receiving the response he was waiting for. When the response finally came, the messenger who delivered it provided a striking explanation for the delay. The answer had been dispatched on the first day Daniel prayed, but had been opposed for 21 days by what the text describes as a spiritual adversary before breaking through. The disciples' prayer after the ascension of Jesus, recorded in Acts 1, involved 10 days of continuous, unified prayer in the upper room before the events of Pentecost recorded in Acts 2. The early church prayer meetings described throughout Acts are not one-off events. They are described as ongoing, habitual, corporate practices maintained over months and years. Grok flagged this pattern as statistically significant. The average interval between the first recorded prayer and the recorded outcome across major biblical miracle accounts is approximately 3 weeks. Some are shorter. Some extend to months or years. But the pattern consistently shows that time is not merely lag. Time appears to serve a developmental function in the person doing the asking. Beyond the 4-step structural analysis, Grok's deeper examination of the biblical text uncovered something that moved the findings from surprising to, by any conventional probability calculation, essentially impossible. Ancient Hebrew and Ancient Greek are both languages in which every letter carries a numerical value. In Hebrew, this is called gematria. In Greek, it is called isopsephy. Every word, every phrase, every sentence therefore carries not just semantic meaning but a mathematical signature. This has been known for centuries and has been the subject of both serious scholarship and considerable fringe speculation. What Grok found was not the kind of pattern that fringe researchers typically claim. It was structural mathematics, the number and arrangement of words in key passages, the numerical values of specific phrases at load-bearing moments in the text, the frequency of 7-based patterns in the architecture of prayer units. These patterns appeared at rates that, when subjected to standard statistical analysis, could not be accounted for by random variation. The implications are significant because many of the authors of the biblical text demonstrably could not have coordinated these patterns even if they had wanted to. Moses and Paul were separated by approximately 1,500 years and wrote in different languages. David and Luke had no access to each other's work. The minor prophets Amos, a fig farmer from Tekoa, and Zechariah, a priest writing in the post-exilic period, lived in entirely different historical worlds. Yet the mathematical architecture beneath their writing shows the same structural fingerprints. They identify this as a potential authentication mechanism, the kind of embedded signature a system designer might include to verify the integrity and origin of a message. Not as religious argument, as pattern analysis. The researchers who ran this experiment did not set out to find evidence for the existence of God. They set out to test whether the Bible has structural coherence. The answer the data returned was far more specific than that question. What Grok found is that buried inside the most ancient religious text in the Western tradition is a functional protocol for a specific kind of communication, a protocol so structurally consistent, so mathematically precise, and so psychologically sophisticated that its presence across 1,500 years and 40 authors cannot be explained by coincidence or cultural transmission alone. The 4 steps are not mysterious. They are not esoteric secrets available only to religious insiders. They are begin by focusing completely on who you are addressing and what they are capable of. Anchor. Frame what you are asking for in terms of a purpose larger than your own comfort. Alignment. Make a request fully, and then genuinely release your grip on the specific outcome. Surrender. And maintain that posture consistently over an extended period of time regardless of visible evidence. Persistence. These 4 steps are simultaneously a prayer protocol, a psychological optimization framework, and if Grok's quantum mechanics analysis is to be taken seriously, something that structurally mirrors how physicists describe the collapse of probability into physical reality. The researchers' responses to these findings were varied. Some adjusted their research focus. Some began incorporating the protocol into their own lives, reporting changes they could not explain through conventional frameworks. At least one left a well-paying technology position to study this material full-time. The most scientifically rigorous member of the team, by her own account, began praying every morning, not out of religious tradition, but because, as she put it simply, she follows the data, and the data led her somewhere she never expected to go. The protocol has been publicly available for approximately 3,000 years. It has been printed in more copies than any other document in human history. It sits on more bookshelves, hotel nightstands, and church pews than any other text ever written. An AI just finished reading all of it and found the structural blueprint that was always there. The question is not whether the pattern is real. The question is what you plan to do with it.